The following program is presented by the Far East Broadcasting Company because stories of people living out the gospel with their lives inspire all of us. FEBC, taking Christ to the world through radio and new media. Learn more at FEBC.org.
One of the great things about Corrie's story, she was a far from perfect person, but she was a great forgiver, and she was totally dedicated to honoring Jesus with her life, and that's a great lesson for any of us.
Coming up on First Person, we step back in time and take a look at the life of Corrie ten Boom and a new book on her life. Welcome to our program. I'm Wayne Shepherd. I'll introduce you to Stan Guthrie, the author of Victorious, as you stay with us now. These interviews are made possible by the Far East Broadcasting Company, who for nearly 75 years has been faithfully broadcasting the good news of the gospel. Without missing a beat, FEBC has not only increased its radio efforts, but is using new digital technologies to reach even more people with the message of hope and salvation. Please take a few moments to learn more about FEBC when you visit FEBC.org. FEBC, until all have heard. The story of Corrie ten Boom is well known to many, although it may be unfamiliar to this generation. Corrie and her family suffered at the hands of the Nazis when they were found to be harboring Jews in their Holland home during World War II. Stan Guthrie decided to take a new look at Corrie's life by writing a book titled Victorious, drawing lessons from the life of this courageous woman for those of us living today.
It's a great story. It was one that I was familiar with, but frankly, I didn't know a lot of the details, but Corrie was a middle-aged woman. I think she was about 52 in 1944 when she and several members of her family and several members of the Dutch underground were arrested by the Gestapo. They were hiding Jews in their home. There was a little place in Corrie's bedroom that had been built into the wall in a secret way, and that was called the hiding place. That's where the title of the book comes from. Anyway, Corrie and her father and her sister Betsy were sent off to prison. Her father, who was in his 80s, died in about a week. She didn't learn about that until months and months later. But they were sent to a prison and then to a couple of concentration camps, including Ravensbrück. And what Corrie found out there was that God is deeper than any darkness that she could experience, that his love triumphed over the evil of the Nazis. And the book itself is just a fascinating picture of life of a Christian under pressure who was not expecting to do anything heroic, but events were thrust upon her, and through her faith and really through the presence of the Lord, she was able to triumph victoriously and spread her message around the world afterward.
Yeah, it's a remarkable story. The hiding place, it became a publishing phenomenon, didn't it?
Yeah, it sold about 3 million copies, and it's still going.
Yeah, I understand that. Of course, a movie was made. Was it made by the Billy Graham Association?
Yes, by Worldwide Pictures, 4 years after the book came out.
I remember it very clearly with Jeanette Clift playing the role of Corrie ten Boom. So this family, a Christian family in Holland, and by the way, years ago, I don't know if it's still there, if it's still operating as a museum or not, but years ago I walked in front of the little watch shop, so to speak, that was her father's.
Yeah, the address is called the Bayet.
Yes.
And there's a Corrie ten Boom house there now, and it's still very famous.
Is it? Okay. All right. I didn't know what had happened in these intervening years, if they kept it going as a museum or not.
It's gone through several iterations.
Yeah. Why did this message, and this again took place, the popularity in the 70s. You're too young for that. I got to meet her at one point. I never did interview Corrie ten Boom, but I did get to meet her, and I was very aware of the story. But why did her message resonate in the 70s the way it did with Americans?
Well, I think one of the reasons was there was a sense that people had not really grappled with what had happened in World War II, for one thing. And Elizabeth Sherrill, who was one of the co-authors with her husband, John Sherrill, was looking for stories that would tell some of the bad things that happened in World War II from a Christian perspective. She wanted a story about that and found it. But I think another and more important reason that it resonated is because Christians were becoming ripe for that sort of thing. This is sort of still on maybe the tail end of the civil rights movement, and evangelicals and other Christians maybe didn't do as much as they should at that time, but there was a sense that they needed more social involvement, more interaction with the world, and so that started happening. And a really big factor, I think, was just the whole subject of Jewish people was really important back then. This was the time of Hal Lindsey and the late great Planet Earth, just the whole sense of prophecy and what are God's chosen people doing? How are they in the plan of salvation? And Corrie's story is all about her incredible love that was given to her by her family for the Jewish people and how she really laid her life on the line for them.
Yeah. I would summarize her message as a message of, in the midst of suffering, God is there. That would be a big part of her message. And forgiveness is a big part of Corrie's message. Yeah,
there's a wonderful story in the book where she is speaking after it's all over and she's been freed and the war is over. And she runs across, for the first time, one of the guards who had been in Ravensbrück with her and her sister. And she recalled that he had been leering at the women who were basically being presented for an inspection of one kind or another, and they were naked.
Imagine, yeah.
And, it was sort of a brutal memory in her life. And yet here's this man who comes up to her after she's spoken about forgiveness, and he thrusts out his hand and says, "Would you please forgive me, Fräulein?"
I remember that so well.
And she was, stunned because she thought she had already forgiven everyone who needed forgiving, and she couldn't raise her arm to forgive him. And she prayed about it several times in those seconds and finally asked Jesus to do it for her. And she felt basically almost like an electric spiritual shock in her arm, and she grasped his hand, and she felt the forgiveness flooding through her, and she called him brother.
Amazing. Well, we not only want to retell the story, but we want to learn the lessons again in our time from Corrie ten Boom. By the way, you mentioned the Sherrills, who co-wrote the book with her. They wrote God's Smuggler, right?
Yeah, and God's Smuggler was about Brother Andrew's ministry, who is another Hollander, and he had actually done a little bit of underground work with Corrie. It was a little bit murky to find out the details.
Yeah, I wanted to ask you about that because I was unaware of that until I saw that in your book.
Yeah, they weren't really close, but, in the underground, you may have worked with people, but you didn't necessarily know a lot of details about them. And in fact, it was better not to know and not to ask questions. But he was like a teenager at this point, and she was in her 50s. So there was not a lot of contact. But they did some writing afterward for a Christian magazine in the Netherlands, and that's how they kind of got to know each other.
Okay.
But he also worked, as you said, with the Sherrills, and God's Smuggler is actually one of my favorite all-time books.
It was a blockbuster book itself, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think it sold 5 million copies, and it's terrific as it shows him bringing the Bible beyond the Iron Curtain and all that kind of stuff.
But I read in your book that he didn't work with Corrie in public because she was too famous.
Well, yeah, she needed her own ministry because it would have been a little confusing to people, and she was very well known. But she wasn't really well known until the book. But she had been working from the mid-'40s right up until 1971 when the book was published. And so she was flying under the radar a lot of the time. She was very well known in Holocaust remembrance circles and a lot of Christian circles. An interesting thing to me is she was much more popular in America than she was in the Netherlands.
How do you account for that?
I don't know. A prophet is not without honor. I don't really know, except I think the American people were ripe for the message in a way that the Dutch weren't. They wanted to maybe put a lot of it behind them because it was so personal and so brutal. The Nazi occupation.
Yeah.
It was tough in America, but it was a different kind of
But Americans
story.
Embraced her, didn't they?
Yeah, they really did from an early point.
She went on the speaking tour, and it's if you don't know what happened with Corrie in the 70s, it's really quite a remarkable story.
Yeah.
Well, Stan, you've written the book, Victorious, Corrie ten Boom and the Hiding Place. What was your goal in retelling this story and going beyond retelling? And, you really make the story applicable to our time as well.
Well, yeah, I got some great advice from a mutual friend, John Wilson. He used to be editor of Books and Culture, and we were sitting down to coffee. John likes to sit down to coffee a lot. And he said, Stan, don't just make it about what happened then. Make it applicable for readers today so that they can know the significance of Corrie. And he told me a little story about when he was going to college in California, probably back in the 70s, around the time that the book was released. He was remarking to a Jewish friend that it was really difficult to write about the Holocaust for whatever reason, but he really liked the story of Corrie ten Boom in The Hiding Place. And his Jewish friend suddenly got very angry and said, I don't think that book should be celebrated at all because it's just an excuse for Christians to feel good about themselves because most of them didn't do anything to help the Jewish people. And what John said was, it's not that I want this to, say, replace the Diary of Anne Frank, which is, almost a completely different genre, though there are many similarities. But I want it to be set alongside of it so that we can see kind of both sides of that coin. And I think that this kind of a book can give us lessons for our own lives, not just to kind of celebrate what one person did, but what we can do in our own context. And I thought that was fantastic advice, Wayne, and I tried to apply it in this book.
So how do you express your goal for the reader who picks up your new book on called Victorious?
I want them to get a real appreciation for Corrie ten Boom as a human being in a certain context, and then take the lessons from her own life, both during the war and afterwards, and apply them in a fresh way in our own lives.
And we'll continue this conversation with author Stan Guthrie as we talk about his book and the life of Corrie ten Boom on First Person.
Listening to your station is my first priority when I get home. Sometimes I even listen twice. First on the radio and then through the internet. Thank you for all your hard work.
The Far East Broadcasting Company receives millions of responses each year from grateful listeners. FEBC is dedicated to taking Christ to the world through radio and new media. To learn more, please visit febc.org. That's febc.org. The Far East Broadcasting Company, until all have heard. My guest is Stan Guthrie. Stan is the author of a brand new book. Matter of fact, it'll be out very soon, if it's not already. It's called Victorious, Corrie ten Boom and the Hiding Place. And we'll have information at firstpersoninterview.com. Do you have a favorite part when you're writing this book, Stan?
I do. It doesn't make a major part in my book, but it's something that really touched me, and that was when Corrie was young, before the war. She was probably in her early 20s or late teens, and she fell in love with a friend of her brother Willem. The man's name was Carol, Karel, and they started taking long walks together and talking and finding mutual interests and those kind of things. And at one point, her brother William took her aside and said, Carol is committed to marrying well. His parents have said that he must marry well, and you don't have any money, so I don't want you to be hurt, but he's going to probably break up with you. Mm-hmm. And Corrie didn't listen, of course, being young and impetuous.
The heart wants what the heart wants, right?
And in love. And yet, Carol's contacts became less and less until one day he showed up at the watch shop with his fiancée, someone else. And of course, Corrie put on a good show for a little while they were there. And then when it was over, she went upstairs to bed and, cried her eyes out. And a little bit later, her father, Casper, who is really one of the heroes of the entire story, came up, sat down and talked to her about it. And she was just distraught. And he said, well, now, Corrie, you're going to have to learn to love him in a new way.
Mm-hmm. Wow. It's emotional for you to retell that.
Well, sure. And just to put it in context, one of the great things about Corrie's story is that she had to learn to do that a lot.
Yeah. Loss was a big part of her story.
Right. And she had to direct it in a God-honoring way, in a productive way, and she did that throughout her whole life. She, as you'll see in the book, she was far from perfect. She had a temper. She was kind of arrogant and pushy at times. She was not always the most patient person in the world. She was also pretty strict about money and sometimes had a temper about it if her ministry was spending more than it had agreed to. So I think that went back to her days in the watch shop when she took over the books for Betsy. And it was chaos back then. I think that always bothered her. But she was a far from perfect person, but she was a great forgiver, and she was totally dedicated to honoring Jesus with her life. And that's a great lesson for any of us.
I get the sense that you, in a way, made a friend with Corrie ten Boom in researching for this book that you've written.
Yeah, how could I not? I mean, there were at least 30 books that she published. I didn't read every one, but I read the ones that I thought were the key ones that would help me tell my story and understand her background. And then, many other people have written about her too. So yeah, if you spend that much time on one subject, you kind of learn that they are a real person. So this is not a hagiography, but I walked away from this thing impressed with her and wondering, what would I do in that situation, whether it was, losing a love or, facing down a Nazi official and telling them that basically they're in great trouble spiritually.
Yeah. We touched on this earlier, but let's dig deeper on the final part of your book, which is really the applicable part of Corrie's story and the lessons from Corrie that we need to learn today and perhaps relearn in our evangelical culture today.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up. I noted a number of things. There are probably a dozen things that you could say are really applicable, and you could have written a chapter on them, but I decided to focus on about 5. And the first one was simply her commitment to evangelism. We're living in an age right now that is becoming increasingly secular and, if I may say so, increasingly hostile to the Christian worldview and to Christians in particular. Obviously, it's not as bad as in other parts of the world. The persecution is not nearly to that level.
It's very subtle in many ways here in America, though.
But I think it's growing.
Yeah.
And so we have to make a decision, as Corrie did. Will we share the gospel, the good news, even when people don't want to hear it? And will we, in that context, be forgiving and be light and salt in our culture?
Yeah, she didn't shy away from naming the name of Jesus, did she?
No, not at all. In fact, there's this one great scene in there. I got it from a collection of thoughts from Brother Andrew. She was at a stadium in East Germany after the war, and it was supposed to be held in a church building, and the crowds were so big that it was overflowing into the courtyard. And so Corrie went to the communist city officials and said, we must have some outdoor speakers so everyone can hear about Jesus. And they said, well, we just can't do that. This is communist East Germany, and the church was supposed to remain within the 4 walls. And she says, well, you know that Jesus is victor, and you know this, and I've got to have them. And they said, well, okay. And they gave it to her. And her whole life was lived in light of Jesus the victor. And that gives us confidence in evangelism that whatever our situation, that his name is going to be glorified and he's going to use it for his purposes.
So we can learn boldness
in
naming the name of Christ.
She was incredibly bold.
Yeah. Another lesson?
Well, another lesson would be just the treatment of the elderly. We are living in an age where youth is worshipped. I mean, that's a cliche, but it's often true. And things like euthanasia are becoming more and more thinkable. We've got several states that have approved it. It's legal in places like the Netherlands, ironically. And the book, The Hiding Place, just over and over talks about not only Corrie, who did most of her at least visible kingdom work when she was middle-aged or older. In fact, she died at age 91. And, until her mid-80s, she was very active. So we need to take that as a lesson to us that people who are older still have something for the kingdom, even if they can't do much of anything. And in fact, Corrie had her last 5 years, she was basically bedridden and paralyzed and couldn't even speak.
I didn't know that.
Which was not what she wanted. She wanted to die with her boots on, but even when she was immobilized, she was still providing lessons in the Lord's faithfulness to those around her.
Was there anything surprising that you learned as you delved into the life of Corrie ten Boom?
The thing that surprised me most was how human she was. Because you don't hear much of the negative. There's one point where I quote from a letter of Brother Andrew to her board. He was on her board at some point because he believed in her ministry. And there was an overspending problem. And he said, now, I don't want Corrie to get upset about this because she sometimes does, so you need to take care of this. And I was kind of amazed at how abrasive she could be, and she didn't even realize it. But then maybe at the end of the day, she would be like, oh no, this is what I've done. And she would repent. And if she could, she would call the person that day to kind of make it right. There's a story of when she's meeting with John and Elizabeth Sherrill. This is years after the book. And some of her former ministry associates come into the room, and they have a great time, and she sends them off with a blessing. And John and Elizabeth say, "Isn't that couple who kind of cheated you out of some money when you were doing some ministry for them? I guess they worked it all out, and you forgave them." And she goes, "They didn't work anything out. They still think that they did everything that's right, but I can tell you they cheated me." And she reached into a desk drawer and pulled out a stack of papers that said, "See, I can prove it to you." and John Sherrill said, "Now, Corrie, you've just been talking about forgiveness, and here you have a whole stack of papers with their sins written down, and isn't that terrible?" And suddenly she realized what she had been doing all those years, and her eyes filled with tears. And as Elizabeth Sherrill tells it, they fed those sheets of paper into the fire, and that was the end of it. But she could be like that, just like we can. And to me, that's an encouragement.
We thank God for the lives of these saints who have gone before us, and all the foibles and faults along with it. We learn from it, don't we?
Yeah. And maybe one more thing I'd like to mention about this. And the book dwells on the anti-Semitism both during the war years and also in our years. That's another application, is that Jews are still subject to that. And as believers, as also people of God's book, we need to care about that, and we need to stand against it.
Stan Guthrie's book, retelling the story of Corrie ten Boom and drawing lessons from her life for today's world, is titled Victorious and will be released in a few days. We'll put more information about the book at firstpersoninterview.com. We're here every week at this time, but if you ever miss an interview, you can always catch up online at firstpersoninterview.com. And to make it even easier, we have a smartphone app for both Apple and Android devices. Search First Person Interview in your app store. I'd like to take a moment to thank our friends and supporters at the Far East Broadcasting Company who make these weekly interviews possible. The gospel message is so important, and FEBC is doing all it can to make sure that as many people as possible hear the Word of God. Learn more at febc.org. Now, with thanks to my friend and producer Joe Carlson, I'm Wayne Shepherd. Join us again for First Person.